Well, perfect autumn late afternoon. It's a pity the world wasn't like this. Well, today I'm going to talk about something which is relevant to the forthcoming election, but also relevant to Western democracies and relevant to the rise of political forces which the buffoon in Washington has been able to use in order to acquire power. So what is the problem with Western democracies in 2025? Why are so many people faced with a choice at an election putting their faith in political parties that are essentially divisive, that essentially create tension, that essentially divide us on the basis of religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Why have these political forces become so popular? Why have the Trumps of the world been able to ride this wave into positions of power in Western democracy? Because let's not forget that Netanyahu and Trump were elected by the people from their sovereign nation state. Irrespective of what we think regarding their policies, the fact is they are elected. So there are tensions within Western democracies which have allowed conditions to be created which allow people like Netanyahu and Trump to be able to capture power and use that power to promote their particular ideological peccadillos. So what is it? Well, in my opinion, the great majority of electors in Western-style democracies, in representative democracies, where people every 3, 4 or 5 years elect representatives to represent their interests, are trapped between two immovable forces. Two immovable forces which have become more and more powerful since the 1960s and 1970s. Two minorities which in many regards have disenfranchised the majority of people. So who are these forces? What are these forces? Well, the force which I'm sure you're familiar with is Neo-Liberalism. Neo-Liberalism is based on 4 concepts: privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation and deregulation. Neoliberalism was sold to the population in Western democracies as a mechanism by which the ordinary person could be enriched. By removing the state, or pushing the state away, pushing the state aside in the equation, people's lives would improve. That is what was promised. And on every statistical available indicator, although we may be able to acquire a greater range of goods, the fact is that neoliberalism has pauperised people, not in terms in Western society as people starving, but in terms of becoming slaves to the financial sector. And that's the dilemma. Neoliberalism has not delivered any positive results to the majority of people in Western democracies and the majority of people in Australia. The fact is that the major political parties in this country who are vying for your vote at the federal election on the 3rd of May pursue neoliberal policies, whether they call themselves Labor, Liberal, National. The fact is they pursue neoliberal policies which have enriched a minuscule part of the population. So that's one force. The majority of people in representative democracies, the majority of people in Australia face. We find ourselves in a vice. On one side, you have neoliberalism. So what's on the other side? Well, the last 50 years has seen the rise and rise of identity politics. Identity politics are necessary in order to improve the lives of minorities who've been marginalised, excluded, exploited. And we have seen successful campaigns over the last half a century in Western democracies, not the rest of the world, but in Western parliamentary democracies, where identity politics have achieved results in terms of decreasing exploitation, in terms of incorporating people into society. This is a feature of all Western democracies. Ideas which are unthinkable 50 years ago are now commonplace. But these ideas, which identity politics revolves around, only affect minorities in the population. So we've got these two disparate movements which have gained ascendancy in the last half a century in the Western parliamentary democracies. Neoliberalism and identity politics. And in between, the great majority have seen no improvement in the lives they lead. They may have seen an improvement in the types of consumer goods they can access. But in terms of services and in terms of having the resources to acquire essentials, every inch of the way has been littered with failures. Obviously in Australia today you can buy the best education money can buy. You can buy the best aged care money can buy. You can buy the best health care money can buy. And that's the key. Resources. And when only 1% of the population has the excessive amount of wealth, over 60%, mainly because of neoliberal policies which have been implemented by successive governments, irrespective of their political hues, you have increasing dissatisfaction in the community. Now, instead of this increasing dissatisfaction in the community with the lives people are living, with the fact they, for the first time in many generations, people's living standards are falling and their children and grandchildren will never acquire the same living standards, the majority looks around. It looks around for scapegoats. It says to itself, why have First Nations people moved forward a little bit? Why do people in same-sex relationships, why have their lives improved as far as their personal lives are concerned? And the list goes on and on. Why hasn't our lives improved? And significantly, many sections of the extra-parliamentary movement now devote themselves almost exclusively to identity politics. And the struggle against neoliberalism, which is a much harder struggle, has almost disappeared. It's a fait accompli. Nothing else can exist. It's neoliberalism or bust. So obviously, when you have the means of communication in the hands of the private sector, in the hands of a minority, a minuscule minority of the private sector, whether it's social media or the legacy media, the fact is that any struggle against neoliberalism is brushed aside, marginalised, ignored. And that's the situation we find ourselves in 2025. I'm standing as a candidate in the Flinders electorate, which is on the Mornington Peninsula. Nice place. Nice place. Now, the ideas that I'm trying to get across are ideas which challenge neoliberalism. But to be brutally honest, it's exceptionally difficult to get people to look outside their personal situation. It's much easier to identify and harass people who have made gains for identity politics than it actually is to challenge the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's the critical problem we face. And nothing highlights this more than the campaigns which have been conducted across this nation during this federal election campaign. Campaigns are based on either opposing identity politics or squabbling amongst ourselves, fighting over the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table in our direction. This is the issue. This is the central issue. The enemy is not the minority of people in this country who have achieved steps towards being accepted for who they are without being marginalised and exploited. They are a minority which deserves to achieve these rights. And they have achieved these rights through their own struggles. But the reality is, at the end of the day, they are a minority. And the fact that the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication are also a minority. And the fact is, whether you have marriage equality or not, the type of life you are able to lead to a significant degree is determined by the amount of disposable income you have. And that's the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is, although the majority feel they are being squeezed by a vice which is demarcated by neoliberalism on one side and identity politics on the other side, the fact is that their lack of progress, their insecurity, the increasing insecurity they are feeling as privatisation becomes the mantra of everyday life. The fact is that that situation has nothing to do with the struggle for identity politics. It's all about accepting the inequalities, the growing inequalities in this land. And while the major political parties are inhibited in terms of their legislative agenda because they're more frightened of the power that is exercised by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the rest of the community, then change will not occur. And that's the issue. The other issue is that many people involved in the struggle for identity politics feel so isolated, they tend to focus on one issue, the issue which concerns them. The fact is, irrespective of who we are, it's the inequalities, the structural inequalities that exist in society. It's the fact that we live in a society where wealth is held by a minuscule minority, and those that wealth determine the parliamentary agenda in a capitalist society, in a parliamentary democracy. That is the critical issue. It doesn't matter how many programs you have to tackle homelessness, how many case managers you throw into the mix. The fact is that you can't tackle homelessness until you tackle the housing crisis. And the housing crisis is a manufactured crisis which has been manufactured by making housing a commodity, not an essential services, by privatising public housing, by not building public housing, by leaving housing to the private sector and investors, both at a local level and internationally. And that's the key. If the majority want change, it's not about voting for political parties whose major agenda is to marginalise, remove the gains made through identity politics. But it's the struggle to ensure that our parliamentary representatives fear us, the people who elect them, more than they fear the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Because ultimately, we get, as we see in the United States of America and Israel, the government we deserve if we don't approach the issue of inequality. That's what happens in society. So when you're casting your ballot, have a look at the policies of the people, whether they're independents or political parties. Have a look at their policies. Are they going to make a difference to the majority of people in this country? Are they engineered in such a way as to oppress the minorities and remove the rights that minorities have struggled for and won over the last half a century? Do they challenge the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Because ultimately, in a parliamentary democracy, we get the governments we deserve, because democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public in a society where wealth is not used to enrich the individual or corporations, but the commonwealth is used for the common good.